Welcome. Come in from the noise and the rush. Set everything down here at the threshold. You've made it to this quiet place, and that's enough. That's more than enough. Whatever the day held, its victories, its disappointments, its endless small demands, all of that can wait outside. Tonight is not for carrying. Tonight is for resting. Find your place now. Let your body settle where it is. Feel the surface beneath you, receiving your weight without question, without judgment, without asking anything in return. You don't have to hold yourself up anymore. You can release that effort. You can let go. Your shoulders can drop. Your jaw can soften. Your hands can open and rest. Even your breathing can slow, finding its own natural rhythm without your help, like a river finding its way to the sea, inevitable, effortless, already happening. Tonight we're going to walk through stories that move like candlelight across paper walls, soft and warm and unhurried. These are old tales, worn smooth by many tellings, about people who learned that the destination is not the point, that losing your way is sometimes finding it, that emptiness is not absence but presence. You don't need to remember these stories. You don't need to understand them or learn from them. They're not here to teach, they're here to carry you. Like a boat carries a sleeping passenger across a dark lake, these words will move you from waking into sleep, from effort into ease, from the bright noise of day into the soft silence of night. If you drift away before the stories end, that's perfect. If you hear only fragments, that's enough. These tales will continue whether you're listening or not, the way stars continue shining, whether we see them or not, the way the earth continues turning beneath sleeping villages. So breathe with me now, slowly, softly. Let this moment be a door you're walking through, leaving behind everything that doesn't serve rest, everything that doesn't serve peace, everything that doesn't serve this simple act of finally letting go. The first story begins in a city of narrow streets and tall buildings, where a man spent his life trying to find his way and learned, eventually, that being lost was the only way to arrive. There was a map maker in that city, whose name was Isamu, and he was known throughout the region for the precision of his work. His maps were perfect, every street accurately rendered, every building correctly placed, every distance precisely measured. Merchants used his maps to find trade routes. Travelers used them to navigate unfamiliar cities. His maps were so detailed, so accurate, that people said walking with one of Isamu's maps was like walking with Isamu himself as your guide. Isamu took great pride in this. He had spent 30 years refining his craft, walking every street he mapped, measuring every distance, noting every landmark. He believed that if a map was detailed enough, accurate enough, complete enough, then anyone could find their way anywhere. No one would have to be lost. No one would have to wander uncertain. The map would be certainty itself, made visible. But Isamu himself had a secret. Despite having mapped dozens of cities, despite knowing the layout of streets and alleys better than almost anyone alive, he had never actually been anywhere. He had walked every street, yes, but he had walked them with his measuring tools, his notebooks, his mind focused entirely on accuracy and detail. He had never simply walked. He had never wandered. He had never allowed himself to be lost. And because of this, despite all his knowledge, despite all his maps, Isamu felt that he knew nothing. He knew where things were, but he didn't know the places themselves. He knew the distance from one temple to another, but he had never sat in either temple, never felt the peace or heard the bells or noticed how the light came through the windows. One autumn, a wealthy merchant commissioned Isamu to map a remote mountain valley. The valley was isolated, difficult to reach, and the merchant wanted a detailed map to help establish a trade route through it. The payment was generous enough that Isamu could retire comfortably after this one final project. Isamu traveled to the valley with his tools and supplies. It took him 3 days of walking to reach it, following a narrow trail that wound through forests and along cliff edges. When he finally arrived, he stood at the valley's entrance and looked out at what he needed to map. The valley was beautiful, more beautiful than he had expected. A river ran through its center, silver in the afternoon light. Small villages dotted the landscape, their houses with thatched roofs clustered together like mushrooms. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks hidden in mist. And everywhere there were paths, dirt paths, stone paths, paths that seemed to lead somewhere, and paths that seemed to lead nowhere. Isamu set up his base in one of the villages and began his work. Every morning he would set out with his measuring tools, walking the paths, noting landmarks, calculating distances. The work was familiar, methodical. He approached it the same way he approached all his mapping projects, systematically, thoroughly, leaving nothing unmeasured. But something strange began to happen. The paths in the valley didn't behave like paths in cities. In cities, streets went from one place to another in straight lines or predictable curves. But here, paths wound and doubled back. They forked without reason. They led to dead ends, or to other paths that led back to where you started. There seemed to be no logic to them, no system. Isamu found this frustrating. How could he map something that made no sense? He walked the same path 3 times, and each time it seemed different, seemed to go to different places. Was he getting confused? Was his memory failing? Or were the paths themselves somehow changing? After 2 weeks of work, he had mapped very little. His notebooks were full of contradictory information. His sketches didn't align. He would walk from village A to village B and measure the distance as 2 miles, then walk back and measure it as 3 miles. How was that possible? One evening, sitting outside the small inn where he was staying, he was approached by an old woman who lived in the village. She had been watching him with curiosity. "You're the map maker," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. You're trying to map the valley." "I am, or I'm trying to. It's proving difficult." "Of course it is." She sat down beside him without being invited, which startled him slightly. "You can't map the valley." "Why not?" "Every place can be mapped." "Not this place. The paths here don't go from one place to another. They go from one state to another." Isamu stared at her. "I don't understand." "The valley is old, very old, and it remembers things. The paths were made by pilgrims centuries ago, and they weren't trying to get anywhere specific. They were trying to change, to transform. So the paths don't measure in distance, they measure in transformation." That's not possible. A path is a path. It has a beginning and an end and a distance between them. The old woman smiled. "Does it? Or does it have a beginning and a transformation and an arrival? And are those things measurable in feet and inches?" She stood and walked away, leaving Isamu sitting there, confused and frustrated. What she said made no sense. It was mystical nonsense. Paths were paths. They could be mapped. But over the following days, as he continued his work, he began to notice things. He would walk a path feeling anxious and arrive feeling calm. He would walk another path feeling certain and arrive feeling uncertain. The physical distance might be the same, but something else was happening during the walking. Something was changing. One morning, he decided to try something different. He left his measuring tools at the inn. He took no notebook, no compass, no instruments. He just walked. He chose a path at random, one that led from the village into the forest. He walked without measuring, without noting landmarks, without trying to remember the way. He just walked, paying attention to the feel of the ground beneath his feet, the sound of birds in the trees, the way the light filtered through the leaves. He walked for hours. The path wound through the forest, sometimes climbing, sometimes descending. It crossed streams, passed through meadows, entered groves of bamboo that whispered in the wind. And Isamu, for the first time in 30 years, was completely lost. He had no idea where he was. He couldn't have drawn a map of where he'd been. He couldn't even say with certainty if he was still in the valley or if he'd somehow walked out of it entirely. And strangely, wonderfully, he didn't care. Being lost felt good. It felt like freedom. He wasn't trying to get anywhere. He wasn't trying to understand anything. He was just walking, just present with each step, and that was enough. The sun began to set. The forest grew darker. Isamu knew he should probably be concerned he was lost in an unfamiliar place with night coming, but he felt no fear, just curiosity. Where would this path lead? Where would he end up? As darkness fell, he saw a light ahead. He walked toward it and found a small temple he hadn't known existed. It was simple, old, with moss growing on its roof and paper lanterns hanging from the eaves. A monk stood in the doorway, as if expecting him. "Welcome," the monk said. "You look lost." "I am," Isamu said, and smiled. "Completely lost." "Good. Come in. Rest. You can find your way back in the morning." Isamu entered the temple. The monk gave him tea and a simple meal of rice and vegetables. They sat together in comfortable silence, and Isamu felt more at peace than he had felt in years, maybe ever. "Why is there a temple here?" Isamu finally asked. "So far from the villages?" "The temple is for people who are lost," the monk said. "That's its purpose, to be here when people need it. But how do people find it if they don't know where it is?" "They don't find it, it finds them. Or rather, being lost finds it. It's the same thing." Isamu thought about this. The paths in this valley, they don't make sense. Not to your mind, perhaps, but they make sense to something deeper. You've been trying to map them with your mind, with measurements and logic. But these paths can only be mapped with your feet, with your body, with the changes that happen inside you as you walk them. But how do I put that on paper? How do I make a map of transformation? The monk smiled. "Maybe you don't. Maybe some things aren't meant to be mapped. Maybe some places are meant to be experienced, not understood. Maybe getting lost is the point." Isamu sat with this through the night. The monk gave him a mat to sleep on, and Isamu lay in the darkness of the temple, listening to the wind in the trees, feeling something shift inside him, some long-held belief about certainty and control beginning to loosen. In the morning, the monk walked him to the edge of the temple grounds and pointed down a path. "That way leads back to your village, or to somewhere else. The path will decide." "The path will decide? You'll understand." Isamu walked. The path wound through the forest, and he tried to remember the way he'd come, tried to map it in his mind out of habit. But he kept losing track, kept finding himself distracted by the beauty around him, a spider's web jeweled with dew, a bird perched on a branch, singing, the smell of earth and pine needles. When he emerged from the forest, he wasn't at his village. He was at a different village, one he'd mapped weeks ago but had never really seen. He stood at its edge and looked at it with new eyes. Children were playing in the street. An old man was sweeping his doorstep. Smoke rose from cooking fires. It was alive in a way his map had never captured, could never capture. He walked into the village and found the small shop where, according to his notes, a weaver worked. He had marked the location on his sketch, Weaver's Shop, north side of Main Street, but he had never gone inside, never met the weaver, never seen what was made there. He went inside now. The weaver was an older woman working at a large loom, and she looked up as he entered. "Can I help you?" I'm the map maker. I mapped this village a few weeks ago, but I never came in here. I never actually saw what you do. Would you like to see now?" "Yes, please." She showed him the loom, explained how the threads worked, let him feel the cloth she was making. It was beautiful work, complex and subtle. And as she talked, Izumu realized that his map of this village had a mark that said Weaver's Shop, but it contained nothing of this skill, this beauty, this woman's life and craft. The map was accurate but empty, true but not real. He thanked her and left. He walked through the village, really looking at it for the first time. He noticed things he hadn't noticed before, the way one house was built slightly crooked because it sat on uneven ground, the way the well was positioned to catch morning sun so the water wouldn't be too cold, the way the paths between houses were worn smooth by generations of footsteps. None of this was on his map. His map showed buildings and streets and distances, but it showed nothing of life, nothing of the actual experience of being in this place. He returned to his inn and looked at all his notebooks, all his measurements, all his careful observations, and he realized that he had been trying to map the valley the way he had mapped cities, as if it were a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be documented. But the valley wasn't a puzzle. It was a living thing, changing, breathing, transforming everyone who walked its paths. He couldn't map that, not with his tools, not with his methods. That evening, the old woman who had spoken to him before found him again. "You've been walking without your tools," she observed. "Yes, I've been getting lost. And what have you found?" "That I don't know how to make the map the merchant wants. I don't know how to map this place." "Then don't." "But I took his money. He's expecting a map. Give him a different map." "What do you mean?" She smiled mysteriously. "You'll figure it out." Isamu spent the next week walking. He walked every path he could find, but not to measure them. He walked them to experience them. He noticed how some paths made him feel energized and others made him feel peaceful. He noticed how some paths seemed to lead you in circles, bringing you back to yourself in unexpected ways. He noticed how the valley itself seemed to breathe, to shift, to respond to the walker. And slowly, an idea formed. He couldn't make a traditional map, but he could make something else. He began to draw, not with measurements and coordinates, but with feeling and experience. He drew the valley as a series of paths, yes, but he annotated them not with distances but with experiences. This path leads to contemplation. This path confronts you with your fears. This path brings unexpected joy. This path circles back to show you what you've been avoiding. He drew the villages not as clusters of buildings but as communities, noting the weaver, the blacksmith, the elder who told stories, the children who played by the river. He drew the temple that appeared when you were lost. He drew the view from the highest path, which showed you how small you were and how vast the world was. It wasn't a map in any traditional sense. It was more like a guide to transformation, a description of what happened to you when you walked the valley's paths rather than where those paths led. When he was finished, he looked at what he had made and felt both proud and uncertain. This wasn't what the merchant had asked for. This wouldn't help establish a trade route, but it was true. It captured something real about the valley that no measurement could capture. He traveled back to the city and presented his work to the merchant. The merchant looked at it, confused. This isn't a map. No, it's not. But it's what the valley is. I asked for distances, routes, practical information, and I couldn't give you that. The valley doesn't work that way. If you walk it trying to get from one place to another as quickly as possible, you'll be lost constantly. But if you walk it, allowing it to change you, allowing yourself to experience it rather than conquer it, then every path leads exactly where you need to go. The merchant was not pleased. He refused to pay Isamu, called his work useless, mystical nonsense. Isamu left with empty pockets, returning to his small workshop in the city. He had failed. He had taken a commission and not delivered what was promised. His reputation would suffer. His retirement was gone. But strangely, he didn't feel bad. He felt light, unburdened. He had spent 30 years making maps that showed people exactly where to go, and he had never understood that sometimes being lost was more valuable than being found. He continued making maps, but differently now. He still measured and documented, but he also walked and experienced. He began adding notes to his maps. Pause here at sunset. Listen for bells from the temple. Watch for birds nesting in the eaves. His maps became guides not just to locations but to experiences. Some clients didn't like this. They wanted pure information, uncontaminated by feeling. But other clients loved it. They said his maps helped them not just find places but truly see them, truly be in them. Years passed. Isamu grew older. His eyes grew weaker, making the detailed measuring work harder. But his walking got better. He would wander through cities with no destination, allowing himself to be lost, discovering places he never would have found if he'd been following a map. One day, an old monk visited his workshop. Isamu recognized him immediately. It was the monk from the temple in the valley. "You came," Isamu said, surprised. "I wanted to see what you made, the map of the valley." Isamu showed him. The monk studied it for a long time, tracing the paths with his finger, reading the annotations. Finally, he looked up and smiled. "This is perfect. It's not what the merchant wanted." "No, but it's what the valley wanted. The valley has been waiting a long time for someone to see it truly, to describe it truly. You've done that. You've made a map of transformation, not of distance. And that's the only kind of map the valley could ever have." The monk bowed deeply and left. Isamu never saw him again, but he kept the valley map on his wall. And whenever he felt himself falling back into old habits, measuring, controlling, trying to pin everything down with accuracy and precision, he would look at it and remember. Remember that being lost was sometimes finding. Remember that some places couldn't be mapped, only experienced. Remember that the most important journeys weren't from one location to another, but from one state of being to another. He worked for another 10 years, making maps that were part art, part guide, part invitation to experience the world rather than just navigate it. And when he was very old and knew his time was ending, he made one final map. It was a map of his own life, not a timeline or a list of accomplishments, but a series of paths he had walked, some that led to joy, some to sorrow, some to confusion, some to clarity. He drew the moments when he had been lost and found that being exactly where he needed to be. He drew the people who had changed him, the places that had transformed him, the experiences that had shaped him into who he was. When he finished, he looked at it and understood, finally, what he had been trying to map all along. Not places, not streets or buildings or distances, but the journey itself, the being itself, the constant transformation that was life. He set down his brush, lay down on his mat, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat slowed, and somewhere in that slowing, he took a final path, one that couldn't be mapped, that led from here to wherever comes next. He walked it without fear, without resistance, simply curious about where it would lead, content to be lost one final time, trusting that being lost would, as it always had, lead him exactly where he needed to be. His apprentice found him in the morning, the map of his life spread out beside him. The apprentice studied it for a long time, trying to understand what all the markings meant, all the annotations and strange notations, and slowly he began to see. It wasn't a map of places, it was a map of becoming, a guide to transformation, a record of a life spent learning that the destination was never the point, that being lost was a kind of finding, that the map of a life couldn't be drawn in advance but only recognized in retrospect, when you looked back and saw that every wrong turn had been right, every dead end had been necessary, every moment of being lost had been exactly where you needed to be. The apprentice carefully rolled up the map and kept it, and when people came asking for maps to places they wanted to go, he would sometimes show them this instead, Isamu's map of his own life, and say, "This is the most accurate map I have. It shows that wherever you're trying to go, you're already on the path. You just have to walk it." And in a village where silence was so common it had become uncomfortable, where people had forgotten how to be together in quiet, there lived a woman who made her living mending things that couldn't be seen. Her name was Chio, and her official work was as a seamstress. People brought her torn clothes, and she mended them with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. But that wasn't her real work. Her real work was mending silences. The village had a problem. People talked constantly, filling every moment with words, chatter, noise. They talked while eating, while working, while walking. They talked not because they had things to say, but because silence made them nervous. Silence felt like emptiness, like something was wrong, like someone was angry or sad or withdrawing. Families would sit at dinner and feel compelled to fill the quiet with conversation about nothing, the weather, the neighbors, trivial complaints and observations. Friends meeting in the street would chat nervously, searching for topics, anything to avoid the discomfort of simply standing together in silence. Even people alone would hum or sing or talk to themselves, unable to bear the quiet of their own company. Chio saw this and understood something others didn't. The silence wasn't broken, the people were. They had lost the ability to simply be present without performing, without filling space with sound. They had lost the comfort of shared silence, of being together without needing to entertain each other. So she began her real work. When someone came to her shop with a torn garment, she would take it and say, "Sit with me while I work." They would sit, and she would begin mending, her needle moving in and out of the fabric in a slow, steady rhythm, and she would not talk. She would simply work, present and focused, and the silence would settle around them like snow. At first, her customers were uncomfortable. They would try to make conversation. "Nice weather today. How is your family? Did you hear about?" Chio would smile gently and say, "Let's just sit together quietly. The work goes better when I can focus." Some customers would leave, uncomfortable with this strange seamstress who didn't chat, but others would stay, and gradually, as they sat in silence, watching her work, something would shift. The nervous energy would drain away. Their breathing would slow. They would stop searching for things to say and simply be present with the quiet, with the soft sound of the needle through fabric, with the afternoon light coming through the window. After 30 minutes or an hour, when the mending was complete, Chio would hand back the garment and the customer would leave. But something would be different. The silence had mended something in them, some frayed edge of their nervous system, some torn place in their ability to simply be. They would come back, not always with clothes to mend, but because they wanted to sit in her shop, wanted to experience that silence again. Chio never turned them away. She would continue her work, and they would sit, and the silence would hold them both. One day, a young mother came to Chio's shop. Her name was Akari, and she was exhausted. She had 3 small children, and her days were filled with their constant noise, their demands, their questions and crying and laughter. She loved them desperately, but she was drowning in noise, starving for quiet. She brought a torn dress her children had ripped it while playing and asked Chio to mend it. "Sit," Chio said. Akari sat. Chio began to work. The silence settled. For the first 5 minutes, Akari's mind raced. She thought about everything she should be doing, the laundry, the cooking, the children who were with her mother right now but who would need her soon. She thought about all the words she had spoken that day, all the questions she had answered, all the comfort she had given. She felt guilty for sitting here, for doing nothing. But Chio just worked peacefully, and gradually Akari's mind began to slow. She watched Chio's hands, the needle moving in and out, the thread pulling the torn fabric together. She heard the soft sounds of the work, the whisper of thread through cloth, the gentle breathing of the woman across from her. And slowly, the noise in her head began to quiet. She wasn't thinking about what she should be doing. She wasn't planning the next thing. She was just here, in this moment, watching hands mend cloth, breathing the quiet air. Tears came, suddenly and unexpectedly. Not sad tears, release tears. All the holding, all the managing, all the constant tending, it all drained out of her in those tears, and what remained was just this: sitting, breathing, being silent, being held by the silence. When the mending was done, Chio handed her the dress. Akari looked at her with wet eyes. "Thank you." "For the mending?" "For the silence." Chio smiled. "Come back whenever you need it." Akari came back often. Once a week at first, then twice. She would find some small thing that needed mending, a button, a seam, a torn pocket, and she would bring it to Chio and sit in the silence. And each time, she would leave feeling more whole, more present, more able to return to her loud, beautiful, exhausting life. Other people noticed the change in Akari. She was calmer, more patient. She could sit with her children without feeling the need to constantly entertain them. She could let them play in silence, could resist the urge to fill every moment with instruction or conversation. When friends asked what had changed, she would say, "I've been learning to sit with silence." Some understood, many didn't, but a few would ask where she learned this, and she would direct them to Chio's shop, and slowly, gradually, Chio's real work grew. People would come not with torn clothes, but with torn spirits, with frayed nerves, with the accumulated damage of living in constant noise. And Chio would sit with them in silence, mending nothing and everything, her presence a kind of medicine, her quiet a kind of healing. The village elders noticed. In a village where silence had been uncomfortable, people were beginning to seek it out. Families were eating meals with less chatter. Friends were walking together without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. The constant nervous noise was settling, slowly, into something more peaceful. One elder, an old man named Takio, came to Chiyo's shop. He didn't bring anything to mend. He just stood in the doorway. "You're changing the village," he said. "I'm just sitting with people. You're teaching them to be silent." Why? Because they've forgotten how. And forgetting how to be silent is forgetting how to be present. It's forgetting how to hear the world, to hear each other, to hear themselves. But silence is uncomfortable, only because you've lost the skill of it. Like any skill, it can be relearned. And you're teaching it? I'm not teaching anything. I'm just being silent. People either join me or they don't. And Takio stood there for a moment, then stepped into the shop. "May I sit?" "Of course." He sat. Chiyo was not working on anything at the moment, so she simply sat across from him, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing slow and steady. The silence stretched. Takio fidgeted. He cleared his throat. He looked around the room, at the walls, at the window, at the floor. He felt the urge to speak, to break this awkward quiet. But Chiyo just sat, comfortable and still, and gradually, her comfort became contagious. Takio stopped fidgeting. His breathing slowed. He let the silence hold him. They sat for perhaps 20 minutes, maybe longer. Time became strange, stretchy, and when Takeo finally stood to leave, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace, deep, wordless peace. "I see," he said. Chiyo nodded. Takeo left, and over the following weeks, something changed in the village. He would call village meetings, and before they began, he would say, "Let's sit together in silence for a few minutes, to settle, to arrive." At first, people were uncomfortable, but he would just sit, modeling the stillness he had learned from Chiyo, and eventually others would settle too. And the meetings that followed were different, calmer, more focused, less reactive. Other elders noticed and began doing the same. Families began sitting together before meals, just breathing, just being together in quiet before the eating and talking began. The nervous chatter that had filled the village began to diminish, replaced by a more comfortable silence. A silence that wasn't empty but full of presence, full of attention, full of the subtle sounds that constant talking had drowned out. Birds singing, wind in trees, the river flowing, children's laughter from a distance, the sound of someone chopping vegetables, the creak of a door. All these sounds, previously buried under the constant noise of words, became audible again, became part of the texture of life. Chiyo continued her work. She mended clothes, yes, but more importantly, she sat with people. She created spaces of silence where people could remember how to simply be, how to exist without performing, how to be together without the constant labor of conversation. Years passed. Chiyo grew older. Her eyes grew weak, making the fine needlework harder. But the sitting work required no eyes, only presence, so she continued. One day, a traveling merchant came through the village. He was from the city, accustomed to noise and bustle and the constant chatter of commerce. But when he arrived in this village, he noticed something immediately: the quiet. Not dead quiet, but a comfortable, living quiet. People went about their business, but they weren't filling the air with unnecessary noise. Curious, he asked someone about it. Why is your village so quiet? We've learned to be comfortable with silence, the person said. Chio taught us. Who is Chio? The woman who mends silence. The merchant found Chio's shop. She was sitting in her usual chair, hands folded, eyes closed. He knocked on the doorframe. She opened her eyes and smiled. Come in. He entered, looking around. I heard you mend silence. What does that mean? Sit with me and you'll understand. I don't have time to sit. I'm just passing through. I need to understand quickly so I can move on. Then you won't understand. The merchant felt frustration, but something about Chio's calm face, her unhurried presence, made him pause. He thought about the constant noise of his life, the endless rushing, the feeling that he was always behind, always chasing something he could never quite catch. He sat down. Chio smiled and closed her eyes again. The merchant sat, uncomfortable at first, checking the position of the sun through the window, calculating how much time he was wasting. But Chio's presence was like gravity, calm, steady, undeniable, and gradually, despite himself, he settled. His thoughts slowed, his breathing deepened. The urgency that drove him every moment of every day loosened its grip just a little. They sat for an hour. When the merchant finally stood to leave, he felt strange lighter somehow, less burdened. He didn't understand what had happened, but he knew something had changed. Thank you, he said. Come back if you ever need silence again. He left the village, and as he traveled, he found himself thinking about that hour in Chio's shop. He had been sitting, that was all. And yet, it had been the most restorative hour he'd experienced in years. He began to build silence into his travels. Instead of rushing from place to place, he would stop sometimes and simply sit in a forest, by a river, in an empty temple. He would sit and breathe and allow the silence to mend whatever was frayed in him. His business suffered slightly. He wasn't as efficient, wasn't making as many deals, but his life improved. He felt more present, more human, less like a machine of transaction and accumulation. Back in the village, Chio continued her work. Her reputation spread slowly. People from other villages would occasionally come, seeking the woman who mended silence. Chio would sit with them, wordless, and they would leave changed, carrying the silence back to their own communities, spreading it like seeds. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside, Chio sat in her shop alone. She was very old now, her body frail, her hands too stiff for fine needlework. But she could still sit. She could still offer silence. She looked around her shop at the walls, the window, the simple furniture. She had spent 40 years here, sitting with people, mending cloth and silence, teaching nothing and everything. She felt satisfied, complete. The village had changed. People knew how to be silent now, how to be comfortable with quiet, how to listen to the world and each other without the constant filter of words. Her work was done. She closed her eyes and took a breath. The silence in the shop was deep and full. She listened to it, to the nothing that was everything, to the absence that was presence, to the quiet that held all sounds, all words, all meaning. She took another breath, and another, each one slower than the last, and somewhere in that slowing, in that deepening silence, she released. Her breathing stopped, her body stilled, and she became part of the silence she had tended for so long, dissolving into it like a stitch dissolving into fabric, visible and then invisible, separate and then integrated, always part of the whole. They found her the next morning, sitting in her chair, hands folded, face peaceful. She looked as if she were simply sitting in silence, waiting for someone to join her. The village buried her quietly, without much ceremony, because that's what she would have wanted. But afterward, people began gathering in her shop. They would sit where she had sat, in silence, continuing the practice she had taught. The shop became a kind of temple, a place people could come to remember how to be quiet, how to be still, how to let silence mend what words had torn. And the silence she had mended in the village held. Years later, travelers would still remark on the unusual quiet of the place, the way people moved through their days with less chatter, more presence. Children grew up learning that silence wasn't awkward or uncomfortable, but natural and restorative. Families would sit together without speaking and feel more connected than when they filled the air with words. Chio had mended something deeper than cloth. She had mended the torn relationship between people and silence, between noise and peace, between constant doing and simple being. And that mending lasted, passed down through generations, a gift that kept giving, teaching everyone who learned it that sometimes the most profound communication happens in silence, that sometimes the greatest healing happens in quiet, that sometimes the truest presence is wordless, just sitting, just breathing, just being together in the held, mended silence that makes us whole. And in a monastery that clung to the side of a mountain like a bird's nest on a cliff, there lived an apprentice monk whose hands were always empty. His name was Kenta, and he had been at the monastery for 3 years. Unlike the other monks, who always seemed busy carrying water, chopping wood, copying sutras, tending the garden, Kenta seemed to do nothing. His hands were always empty. His days appeared aimless. He would sit for hours looking at nothing. He would walk the monastery grounds with no apparent destination. He would stand in the courtyard and watch the sky. The other monks found this troubling. Monastic life was structured. There were tasks to complete, schedules to follow, work to be done. Everyone had responsibilities. But Kenta seemed to have none, or if he did, he wasn't fulfilling them. The abbot noticed but said nothing. He watched Kenta with interest, curious about what the young monk was doing or not doing. One day, a senior monk named Jiro approached the abbot. "Master, I must speak about Kenta." "Yes." "He does nothing. He sits, he walks, but he accomplishes nothing. The rest of us work, but he seems exempt. It's not fair. It's not right. Either he should work like the rest of us, or he should leave." The abbot was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Have you ever watched him? I mean, really watched him?" "I've seen him sitting around doing nothing, if that's what you mean." "Watch him tomorrow. Closely. Tell me what you see." Jiro agreed, though he was skeptical. He knew what he would see: a lazy young monk avoiding his duties. The next morning, Jiro positioned himself where he could observe Kenta without being noticed. Kenta emerged from the dormitory at dawn and stood in the courtyard, his hands empty, his face calm. He didn't move for perhaps 20 minutes, just stood there, breathing, looking at nothing in particular. Then he walked to the well. He stood beside it for a while, looking down into the dark water. A senior monk came to draw water, and Kenta stepped aside without being asked, making space, then returned to looking into the well after the senior monk left. After perhaps half an hour, Kenta walked to the garden. He stood at the edge of it, watching the other monks work, weeding, watering, trimming. He didn't help, he just watched. But his watching was present, attentive. He seemed to be truly seeing the work, not just glancing at it. One of the working monks straightened up, his back clearly aching. Kenta immediately picked up the water bucket the monk had been using and carried it to the far side of the garden where it would be needed next. Then he returned to watching, his hands empty again. Jiro frowned. Had Kenta helped? It was hard to say. He'd moved a bucket, but that wasn't really work. That was just seeing what was needed and doing it. Kenta moved on. He walked to the meditation hall, stood outside it for a while, then entered. Jiro followed quietly and watched through the doorway. Inside, several monks were sitting in meditation. One monk was struggling, his posture was poor. He kept shifting, clearly uncomfortable. Kenta approached him silently, knelt beside him, and gently adjusted the man's cushion, repositioning it slightly. The monk's posture improved immediately. The discomfort in his face eased. Kenta bowed silently and left, his hands empty again. Jiro watched all day. Kenta never took on a formal task, never had his hands full of tools or buckets or brooms. But he was constantly present, constantly noticing, constantly responding to small needs. A door left ajar, Kenta closed it. A tool dropped, Kenta picked it up and placed it where it belonged. A young monk looking lost, Kenta stood near him, not speaking, just present, until the young monk's confusion cleared and he continued on his way. Kenta's hands were empty because he wasn't carrying his own agenda, his own tasks. He was available, completely available, ready to respond to whatever was needed in each moment, without the burden of his own plans and schedules weighing him down. By evening, when Jiro reported back to the abbot, his frustration had transformed into something else, not quite understanding, but a sense that he had witnessed something important. "He works," Jiro said slowly, "but not like the rest of us. We work from plans, from lists of tasks. He works from presence, from seeing what's needed." The abbot nodded. "His hands are empty so they can be full when needed. The rest of you fill your hands with your own work, your own plans, and when unexpected need arises, you can't respond, your hands are already full." Kenta keeps his hands empty. It looks like doing nothing, but it's actually doing everything. Jiro thought about this. But if we all worked like that, if we all just walked around with empty hands, nothing would get done. Someone has to plan. Someone has to maintain structure. Yes, the abbot agreed. Someone has to hold the structure, but someone also has to be free within the structure. Someone has to be available for the unexpected. Both are necessary. Kenta has chosen the path of empty hands. You've chosen the path of full hands. Neither is better. Both are needed. Then why did you have me watch him? Because those with full hands sometimes forget that empty hands are working too. They think emptiness is laziness, but emptiness is readiness. It's potential. It's the space from which all action can arise. Jiro bowed and left, his mind churning with these ideas. Over the following weeks, he found himself watching Kenta more and noticing how the monastery functioned. There were the planned workers, those who chopped wood, carried water, maintained the schedules. And there was Kenta, moving through it all with empty hands, filling gaps, responding to needs, being present. Both were necessary. The monastery needed structure and spontaneity, planning and presence, full hands and empty hands. One day, Jiro approached Kenta directly. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you keep your hands empty?" Kenta looked at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "I don't keep them empty. They just are empty. There's a difference." I don't understand. When you keep something empty, you're maintaining emptiness deliberately. That's still doing. But when something is just empty, naturally empty, there's no effort, no maintaining. It's just open, ready. But you must have trained to achieve this. It must have taken effort. Kenta smiled. When I first arrived, I tried to be like the other monks. I took on tasks, followed schedules, filled my days with work. But I kept failing. I would start a task and something would distract me, a bird, a cloud, another monk who seemed to need something. I couldn't stay focused on my own work because I kept noticing everything else. That sounds difficult. It was. I felt like a failure. The senior monks were frustrated with me. I was frustrated with myself. And then one day, the abbot called me to his chamber. I thought he was going to tell me to leave, that I wasn't suited for monastic life, but he didn't. No, he asked me, why do you keep trying to fill your hands when they want to be empty? And I didn't know what he meant. So he said, stop trying to be like the others. Be like yourself. Your hands are empty. Let them be empty. That's your practice. And you did? I stopped trying. I stopped taking on formal tasks. I just existed, walked around, watched. And gradually, I noticed that my empty hands kept getting filled not by my own plans, but by needs that arose. Someone needed help, something needed moving, a moment needed presence. My hands would fill, do what was needed, then empty again. And I realized this was my work, being available, being ready, being empty, so I could be full when needed. Jiro thought about his own life. His hands were always full of tasks, plans, responsibilities. When someone needed something unexpected, he often couldn't help because he was already committed to his own agenda. His fullness was also a kind of unavailability. Could I learn this? He asked. Could I learn to keep my hands empty? You could try, but the trying might prevent the emptiness. It's a strange practice. The more you try to achieve it, the further away it gets. Then how do I learn it? By failing at everything else, probably, Kenta smiled. By being so bad at keeping your hands full that they eventually give up and become empty. By being so distracted by the world around you that your own agenda dissolves. By being, finally, a complete failure at being disciplined. Jiro laughed. That doesn't sound like a practice. That sounds like giving up. Maybe. Or maybe giving up is the practice. Jiro returned to his work, to his full hands, to his structured days, but something had shifted. He began to notice Kenta more, began to appreciate the way empty hands moved through the monastery, filling gaps, catching things before they fell, being present in ways that full hands couldn't be. And occasionally, he would deliberately set down whatever he was carrying and just stand for a moment, hands empty, feeling what that was like. It was uncomfortable at first. He felt like he should be doing something. But gradually, in those moments, he would notice things he'd been too busy to see. A leak in the roof that needed fixing, a young monk struggling with loneliness, a garden stone that had shifted and needed repositioning. Small things, but important things, things that structured work missed because structure looks ahead to planned tasks, not around to immediate needs. Years passed. Kenta remained at the monastery, his hands still empty, his days still apparently aimless. But everyone had learned to see his work, to appreciate his presence, to understand that empty hands were working hands, just working in a different way. One winter, a harsh storm hit the mountains. The snow was deep, the wind fierce. The monastery was cut off from the outside world, and supplies ran low. The monks had to ration food, conserve firewood, manage resources carefully. During this time, those with full hands with plans and structures and schedules kept the monastery running. They maintained order, distributed resources, ensured everyone's basic needs were met. But Kenta's empty hands did something different. He noticed the monk who was sitting alone, struggling with the isolation. He sat with that monk in silence, his empty presence a comfort. He noticed the elder whose hands were too cold to hold his tea bowl properly. He held the bowl for him, helped him drink, his hands temporarily full but ready to empty again. He noticed the youngest monk crying quietly in the dormitory late at night. He sat beside him, said nothing, just present, just there, his empty hands the fullest thing the young monk needed. The storm passed. The monastery returned to normal, but the lesson remained. Structure and spontaneity, planning and presence, full hands and empty hands, all necessary, all part of the whole. Kenta grew old. His body weakened, his steps slowed, but his hands remained empty, and that emptiness remained useful. He could no longer carry heavy loads, but he could still notice what needed noticing, still be present where presence was needed, still offer the gift of availability. One spring morning, he was found in the garden, sitting on a stone bench, his hands resting empty in his lap, his face peaceful. He had died sometime during the night, quietly, without fuss, the way he had lived. They buried him in the monastery cemetery, and on his gravestone, they carved not his accomplishments or titles, but simply, he kept his hands empty, and so they were always full. The other monks continued the practices of the monastery, chopping wood, carrying water, maintaining structures, but they also learned to occasionally empty their hands, to pause in their tasks, to be available for the unexpected. And they taught new monks that there were two kinds of work, the work of full hands and the work of empty hands, and both were necessary, both were sacred. Both were ways of serving the truth that life needed structure, and it also needed space. It needed planning, and it also needed presence. It needed doing, and it also needed being. And in that balance, the monastery thrived, held by hands that were sometimes full and sometimes empty, always working, always present, always responding to the needs of the moment with whatever was called for action or stillness. Doing or being, grasping or releasing, filled or empty, both and neither, the eternal dance of hands that knew when to hold and when to let go. And in a library that stood at the edge of civilization, where the last houses of the last village gave way to endless forests, there lived a man whose job it was to remember what everyone else had forgotten. His name was Osamu, and he was the keeper of the library. But this was not an ordinary library. It didn't contain books anyone wanted to read. It contained books everyone had forgotten existed, histories of vanished villages, records of extinct crafts, languages no one spoke anymore, stories no one told, songs no one sang. The library was a graveyard of forgotten knowledge, and Osamu was its caretaker. He had inherited the position from his father, who had inherited it from his father, back through generations to the library's founding hundreds of years before. The work was simple. Maintain the building, preserve the books, keep everything organized and cataloged. No one came to read anymore. No one asked for books. The library existed in a kind of suspended animation, maintaining things that no one needed, preserving knowledge that no one wanted. Osamu sometimes wondered why he bothered. What was the point of preserving books no one would read? Why maintain a library that served no purpose? But it was his duty, passed down through generations, and he fulfilled it faithfully, even as he questioned its meaning. Every morning, he would walk through the library's many rooms, checking for damaged water leaks, insect infestations, deteriorating bindings. He would catalog new editions, books sent from other libraries that no longer wanted them, volumes rescued from abandoned houses, manuscripts discovered in old trunks. Everything that was forgotten elsewhere eventually found its way here. The library was vast. Osamu estimated it contained over 50,000 volumes, and he had read perhaps 100 of them. Most were too specialized, too obscure, written in languages he didn't know or about topics that held no interest. But occasionally he would pull a book at random and read it, just to know what stories were dying here, what knowledge was vanishing. One day, a young woman arrived at the library. This was unusual. No one came to the library. It was too remote, too forgotten, too unimportant. But here she was, standing in the doorway, looking uncertain. "Is this the library?" she asked. "Yes, though I should warn you, we probably don't have what you're looking for." "How do you know what I'm looking for?" "Because no one knows what they're looking for when they come here. This library contains only forgotten things. If you knew you wanted it, it wouldn't be here." The young woman smiled. "Then maybe I've come to the right place. I'm looking for forgotten things. Pable, Pable. Why? I'm a scholar. I study lost languages. I've heard rumors that this library contains manuscripts in languages that no longer exist. I want to see them, to document them, to preserve whatever knowledge I can before it's completely lost." Osamu felt something stir in his chest. Interest, maybe, or hope. Someone wanted these books. Someone saw value in what he'd been preserving. "Come in," he said. "I'll show you what we have." He led her through the library, pointing out sections: extinct languages, vanished cultures, forgotten histories. The young woman's eyes grew wider as they walked. She would stop occasionally, pull a book from a shelf, gasp at its contents. "This is incredible," she said. "Do you know what you have here? Some of these texts are unique, the only remaining copies. If this library were to burn, entire languages would vanish completely." "I know," Osamu said. "That's why I maintain it. But no one knows about this place. Scholars would travel from across the world to access these texts. You should make this library known. You should—" "No," Osamu said firmly. "Why not?" "Because this is a library of forgotten things. Making it known would change its nature. Scholars would come, yes, but they would take the books, or copy them, or spread their contents. And then they wouldn't be forgotten anymore. They'd be known. And this library would lose its purpose." "Its purpose? What purpose? Isn't the purpose of a library to share knowledge?" "Most libraries, yes. But this library is different. Its purpose is to hold what the world has forgotten, to be a place where forgetting is honored, where what has been lost can rest without being constantly disturbed by attempts to revive it." The young woman stared at him. That's absurd. Knowledge should be shared, preserved, kept alive. Letting it be forgotten is irresponsible." "Is it? Or is forgetting natural? Necessary even?" "The world creates more knowledge than it can hold. Some things have to be forgotten to make room for new things. This library is where those forgotten things rest. I don't think we should disturb that rest." "But you're disturbing it by reading the books yourself." "Occasionally, yes, but I'm the keeper. That's my privilege and my burden. I occasionally wake the sleeping knowledge, spend time with it, then let it sleep again. But I don't take it out into the world. I don't try to resurrect it. They argued about this for hours. The young woman believed passionately that knowledge should be preserved and shared. Osamu believed equally passionately that forgetting had its place, its purpose, its dignity. Finally, the young woman asked, "May I at least stay here, work with the texts while I'm here? I won't take anything. I won't copy anything without your permission. I just want to see them, to learn from them." Osamu considered. "How long?" "A month, maybe longer if you'll allow it. You can stay, but you must respect the nature of this place. The books are asleep. You can look at them, but gently. And when you leave them here. They don't go out into the world." She agreed. The young woman, her name was Yuki, stayed for a month, then 2, then 6. She would spend her days reading, taking notes, occasionally asking Osamu questions. And gradually, something unexpected happened. Her views began to change. At first, she had been eager, ambitious, wanting to document everything, to save every scrap of knowledge. But as she spent more time with the texts, she began to understand what Osamu had been trying to tell her. These weren't just forgotten books. They were completed books. Their time had passed. They had served their purpose in their time, and now they were resting. She began to feel it would be violent to resurrect them, to drag them back into the light of the contemporary world where they would be analyzed, categorized, perhaps misunderstood or misused. Better to let them rest here, honored but undisturbed, like ancestors in a cemetery. One evening, she said to Osamu, "I think I understand now. This isn't really a library. It's a kind of temple." "Yes," Osamu said. "That's exactly what it is. You're not a librarian. You're a priest." "I suppose I am. And the books aren't really books anymore. They're spirits, maybe. The spirits of dead knowledge, and you're tending their graves." Osamu smiled. "I've never thought of it that way, but yes, that's what this is." Enbiri, Kend, coming to stay inside. Yuki stayed another month, but her work changed. She stopped taking notes. She stopped trying to document and preserve. She just read respectfully, the way you might sit with an elder and listen to their stories, not to record them, but just to honor them, to let them know someone is listening, someone still cares, even as they fade. When she finally left, she took nothing with her, not notes, not copies, not even memories. Really, she let what she had read fade naturally, the way dreams fade after waking. "Thank you," she said to Osamu. "I came here thinking I would save these books, but they don't need saving. They need exactly what you're giving them, a dignified resting place." After she left, Osamu continued his work. But something had changed. He no longer felt alone in understanding the library's purpose. Someone else had seen it, had understood it, and that validation meant something. Years passed. The library continued to receive forgotten things, books, manuscripts, scrolls, tablets. Osamu cataloged them, preserved them, let them join the great sleep of forgotten knowledge. Sometimes he would read them. He would spend an evening with a text that no one had touched in 100 years, would learn its secrets, its wisdom, its stories. And then he would close the book and return it to the shelf, and the knowledge would fade from his mind, naturally, as all things fade. He grew old. His body weakened. The work of maintaining the library became harder, But he continued because this was his duty, his calling, his purpose. One day, a messenger arrived from the capital. The government had learned of the library and wanted to catalog it, to integrate it into the national library system, to make its contents available to scholars. Osamu refused. The government sent officials. They tried to pressure him, to convince him, to explain that knowledge was a national treasure that needed to be accessible. Osamu listened patiently, then said, "This library contains forgotten knowledge. The moment you make it accessible, it ceases to be forgotten. It becomes known, and then it's no longer what it is. The library would be destroyed not by burning it, but by making it known." "That's ridiculous," the officials said. "Knowledge doesn't cease to be knowledge just because people know about it. Doesn't it? These texts were once known. They were studied, taught, used, and then they were forgotten naturally because they were no longer needed. They completed their cycle. Trying to resurrect them would be like trying to make an old person young again. It's not honoring them. It's refusing to accept that their time has passed." The officials left frustrated, but they returned with orders. The library would be cataloged whether Osamu cooperated or not. That night, Osamu made a decision. He walked through the library's many rooms, touching the shelves, the books, the accumulated knowledge of centuries. He felt their peace, their restfulness, their satisfaction at being forgotten, at being allowed to complete their journey, and he understood what he had to do. He gathered a few precious texts, the ones he loved most, the ones he had read and reread over the years. He placed them in a waterproof box and buried them in the forest behind the library, not to preserve them for discovery, but to return them to the earth, to complete their cycle fully. Then he returned to the library. He sat in his father's chair, the chair where he had sat for 40 years, and he looked around at the books, the forgotten knowledge, the sleeping spirits. "Thank you," he said to them. "You've taught me so much. Not your contents, I've forgotten most of that, but your presence, your completion, your peace with being forgotten, that's been the real teaching." He closed his eyes, his breathing slowed, and somewhere in that slowing, he joined the books in their forgetting, in their sleep, in their peaceful completion. They found him the next morning. The officials, arriving to begin their catalog, discovered the keeper of forgotten things had himself been forgotten by life, had completed his cycle, had joined the great rest he had been tending. They didn't understand his work. They cataloged the library, sent the books to various institutions, tried to resurrect the forgotten knowledge. Some texts were studied. Most were ignored even when made available. They remained forgotten because forgetting was their nature. But the few books Osamu had buried in the forest remained undiscovered. They rested there, slowly decomposing, returning their knowledge to the earth, completing the cycle from knowing to forgetting to nourishing, from form to formlessness, from book to soil to tree to air to sky to nothing and everything. The way all things complete their journey, the way all knowledge eventually returns to the unknown from which it came, honored and released, forgotten and free. The stories are beginning to fade now. The words are dissolving like footprints in sand, like breath in cold air. And that's exactly as it should be. You've been listening, or perhaps you stopped listening long ago, carried away into sleep by the rhythm of these tales. Either way is perfect. These stories were never meant to be remembered. They were meant to carry you across the threshold from waking into rest, and whether you heard all of them or only fragments doesn't matter. Your body knows what to do now. It's been learning all night, through story after story, the same lesson told in different ways. Let go, release, allow completion, trust the cycle. Everything that rises falls, everything that fills empties, everything that begins ends, and all of it is natural, necessary, part of the great turning that makes life possible. The map maker learned to be lost, the woman mended silence, the monk kept his hands empty, the librarian tended what was forgotten, and you've learned to let go of today, to release your grip on waking, to trust the great forgetting that is sleep. Your breathing is slow now, deep and slow. Your body is heavy, or maybe it's light. Maybe you can't tell anymore. The boundary between your body and what holds it has softened, blurred. You're being held by the night, by the darkness, by the great silence that has always been here, waiting beneath all the noise. There's nothing left to do. No more listening required, no more staying awake. These words will continue for a little while longer, but you don't need them. You can let go now. You can drift. Think of the calligrapher who forgot how to write and found, in forgetting, the freedom to create. Think of the fisherman who taught patience by sitting. Think of the leaf that held on until it was time to release. Think of Kenta's empty hands, ready for whatever came, and then stop thinking. Let even those images fade. Let everything fall away until there's only this: breath, darkness, the soft dissolution of consciousness into sleep. You are safe. Deeply, completely safe. Held by the earth beneath you, by the air around you, by the vast patience of the night that asks nothing of you except that you rest. The stories are complete now. The lessons have been told. The journey from waking to sleeping has been walked. And here you are, at the destination, which was never a destination at all, but simply a returning home, a coming back to the natural state of rest that your body has always known how to find. Sleep now. Let go of these words. Let go of listening. Let go of everything except the simple fact of being here, being held, being carried by sleep into the deep restoration that happens when we finally stop trying. Breathe, release, dissolve. The map maker found his way by being lost. The silence was mended by sitting in it. The empty hands were full because they were available. The forgotten knowledge rested in peace. And you are finding rest by releasing into it. You are mending what was torn by being gentle with yourself. Your hands, empty of day's work, are full of night's peace. And tomorrow will be forgotten tonight, released into sleep, returning in the morning transformed, new, ready to be lived again. But that's tomorrow. Tonight is for this: darkness, breath, the slow, gentle fading of everything into nothing, into everything. Sleep. Deeply, completely. Let go. Rest. The stories are done. The night holds you. Sleep claims you gently, softly, completely, and you release into it like a leaf falling, like silence settling, like forgetting claiming what needs to be forgotten, like the keeper of all lost things finally, gratefully, closing his eyes. Sleep now.